Dr. Redlener, give me your sense, your reaction to what we saw just now from President Trump in terms of definitely tonally different than we've seen him before, I would say, but just on the facts. What did we?
So first of all, we now have Trump fully in Wonderland here. This is like surreal, and giving himself a 10 out of 10 as his grade of performance was, I'd say, laughable, but I'd probably use other language if we're not on the air. But the thing is, here's what we have now. We have the president continuing to self-congratulate. I'm surprised his arm is still functioning from patting himself on the back day after day. It is an absurd situation. We're getting misinformation and directions from the federal government, still, including on testing, including on the crisis that we're facing. Now, we're getting a tsunami that is coming at the hospital system. But let's started.
Right, but let's be clear about one thing. The fact that the president said, we were watching it when he started this press conference. He came out and said that he thought that it might not be until July or August that this thing was over, which at least to me, and again, I'm famously not a great fan of President Trump, so people know that. But it did seem at least there was a different tone to President Trump, and in acknowledging that the thing could last that long, it seemed to be like maybe he was starting to grapple a little bit with the reality that's at hand. On the other hand, we've got this 15-point guidelines that he's no new orders, a bunch of guidelines, many of them kind of relatively straightforward. I'm curious whether you think the tone, which was more serious, I think, apart from the self-congratulation, the tone was more serious on the substance of what he was saying and what needs to be done. Is it too little that he's suggesting right now? Do you think he's not got his arms around the problem in a realistic sense?
Yeah. So listen, he's right. It's not going to be before the summer that this is over with, or at least has peaked. The problem is now we're facing another issue that they're not dealing with. Now, first it was the testing issues, the debacle that we've had and continue to have. Now what they're not looking at is the actual crisis in the hospitals is happening this week, today.
Yes.
There's not enough personal protective equipment, including masks and gowns. Hospital emergency physicians and hospital administrators are now already beginning to freak out about what's not happening. The federal government should have been thinking and planning for this many, many weeks ago. It's similar to what they messed up with in terms of the testing.
When I saw Governor Cuomo today on television talking about how no matter what we do, we are not going to be able to beat the curve, it sounded to me, I read that as Governor Cuomo basically saying, we are on the way to looking like Italy here in the state of New York. And he called for the Army Corps of Engineers to come up here and start building new ICU units, new hospital beds, new hospital coordinates. Is that what's necessary at this point in the state?
That's going to be necessary very shortly, and they should be doing that. But who's going to staff these new beds?
Right.
Are we going to take people out of their regular hospital day jobs and put them into these new facilities? I don't think so. Are there enough federal assets to staff these facilities? I don't think so either. But if people should be aware of the fact that something called a strategic national stockpile, which is supposed to be the backup supplies, they're that we don't have enough of them. We have 92,000 mechanical ventilators around the country. Another 30,000 maybe in the national stockpile. We'll need double that number. I have no idea where they're going to come from. But right now, my son's an emergency medicine doctor here. They need face masks. It's very basic what they need, and the government is, again, lagging way behind.
Phil Rucker, I want to ask you about what's going on there behind the scenes at the White House. As I say, I agree with Dr. Redlener that President Trump continues to congratulate himself, and yet to hear him say that he thought the crisis could last till mid to late summer at least, did mark, to my ear at least, a striking shift of tone on the part of the president's compared with what we heard as recently as 24 hours ago on Sunday. So give me a sense of what's going on behind the scenes there, and specifically talk a little bit about what the debate internally about how to deal with this problem that Dr. Redlener just cited, which is, we heard him we read the reporting from the New York Times about him being on the phone with the governor saying you got to figure out how to get these ventilators and these other pieces of equipment yourself. Talk a little bit about all that stuff.
Yeah, well, John, first of all, I have to agree with you. There's a sea change today in how President Trump acted in public from just yesterday. I was in the briefing room at that briefing yesterday. He was scolding the media. He refused to take questions. He was in a pouty mood, and he offered no real information for the American people or for state and local leaders, guidelines about what they should be doing in their communities. Today, totally different. He had new information. He talked about how long this would be. He gave a sober analysis of the situation. He even condemned his own ally, Congressman Devin Nunes, who had said over the weekend that people ought to be going out to restaurants. Trump reminded the public that that's not what the experts recommend. What's been going on behind the scenes, and my colleagues and I reported on this over the weekend, there has been total dysfunction and chaos in this White House for the last several weeks, trying to wrap their arms around this crisis, trying to come up with action, trying to get that testing system sped up. And it's really not been until the last couple of days that there's been sort of a new sense of urgency around this and a plan starting to come together. And the most important element of that plan seems to be the president recognizing the magnitude of the crisis. And I think we saw today for the first time that he really understands what it is he's grappling with.
Phil, you have reported a lot. You know the president's state of mind as well as any reporter in Washington. It's today's change in tone, this afternoon's change in tone, is it just as simple as the fact that the stock market is behaving the way it's behaving? The president's obsessed with the stock market. We know that's true. We heard him say just now, well, the stock market will take care of itself, but we know he doesn't really believe that. He's fixated on it, always has been, and has he basically been beaten into a sense of dawning reality by watching the stock market now hammer him for the third historic day in the last 6 days of trading?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that is a key indicator that's influencing his thinking on all of this. You know, he thought when he was out there in the Rose Garden Friday that he had turned the stock market around and that the stocks, investors would be confident again. And obviously that was not the case over the course of the weekend. And so that's a big indicator for him. But I suspect, and subsequent reporting is going to have to figure this out, but I suspect there might be more to it. I know that a number of White House officials have been feeling for several days now, for weeks really, that the president has been hurting the cause, that he has been spreading misinformation, not taking it seriously, not acting presidential, and that's been a net negative for the federal government's efforts to try to contain and mitigate the crisis. And I wonder if some advisors got through to him and really sort of grabbed him and shook him up and told him, Mr. President, you've got to take this seriously and act differently.
Ron Klain, I follow you carefully at all times, but especially now because of your experience with the Ebola crisis from, 6 years ago now. I saw you quote tweeted a WHO tweet today talking about the testing shortage. You can't fight a fire blindfolded. Test was their tweet. You quote tweeted it. I'm curious about whether what you're seeing, the testing thing seems like a huge continuing problem. We've heard now some encouraging talk at least meant to encourage us, that now that the private sector is fully engaged, that the testing crisis is going to abate in short order. But so far, at least to my eye, it doesn't look like there's any sign that that's happening. So talk a little bit about that, about what you're seeing and what concerns you have and explanations you might offer.
Yeah, look, I agree with you and Phil. We heard better words from the president today. But we still don't see any really different actions. At the end of that press conference, finally they acknowledged we're still only testing a few thousand people a day. 2 weeks ago, they said it would be 1 million by that week, and then 1 million by last week, and now 1 million by next week. I mean, I think at this point in time, the American people were entitled to say, I'll believe it when I actually see it. What we're seeing still is we're one of the lowest testing rates of any developed nation. The second front is this hospital bed problem that Dr. Redlener mentioned that was the subject of the sparring between President Trump and Governor Cuomo today. And Governor Cuomo laid out an idea of having the Army Corps of Engineers come and build temporary hospitals. There are problems with that, but that's probably the best solution. And, all President Trump did was send a snarky tweet back. So no action really on that hospital problem. And the third is the other problem Dr. Redlener mentioned, which is about equipment. And that's what John Martin's report in the New York Times is about, which is the White House kind of basically saying, in terms of equipment, you're on your own. And, John, that's not only bad because you're on your own is never a good answer. It's bad because that equipment will wind up in the wrong place. We had a whole project when I was a White House Ebola response coordinator of coordinating the supply chain to make sure the supplies were going not to the most powerful hospitals, but where they were needed the most. Right. And so just kind of letting the supplies go wherever they might is a formula for further disaster. So on terms of talk, better talk, actions, not much improvement.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.